Good evening. My name is Christian Jewell and I'm the manager of the Asia Pacific Design Library here at State Library of Queensland. I'd firstly like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that we gather on tonight, the Turrbal and Yugara people, and pay respects to their ancestors who came before them. I'd like to welcome you all to our 8th UQ Architecture Lecture in partnership with the University of Queensland. Before we start, I need to remind everyone, if you have your mobile phones on, to please switch them to silent. If you need to leave at any time during the lecture, we just ask that you take the back exit so you don't disrupt the speaker. We're also recording tonight's lecture for our Design Online website, and if you have any concerns, if you ask a question or don't want to be included, please let us know. There'll be time for questions at the end as well, and we really encourage you, if you have something to ask, to put your hand up. We'll be coming around with microphones. If you're too shy, you can also use the Twitter hashtag, which is APDL Lecture, and we'll ask the question for you. I also wanted to make mention of an event that we're hosting next Wednesday night in the Design Lounge. Many of you will know about the APDL Design Lounge, which hosts our collection on level 2 out here. We're looking at new ways to activate that space and present the collection. I know a lot of people would have ideas for that space, so we'd like to invite you to come along next Wednesday night, and you can RSVP at slq.eventbrite.com and get more information there. Okay, I'd now like to welcome Lewis Fiducci to introduce tonight's speaker, David Leatherbarrow.
Thanks, Christian. It is my pleasure to introduce David Leatherbarrow. David is Professor of Architecture at the University of Penn of Pennsylvania, and he's also chairman of the graduate group in architecture, which is their PhD program. He teaches architectural design, history, theory. He teaches on gardens and cities. He's the author of many books. You may have seen a few of them outside. And I think that all this situates him in a privileged position to talk about the subject that today he has brought, design and research. To reflect on an issue that he knows and he has written about, and to frame it in the subtitle of his lecture as the contemporary task of design as research. The title, the first part, Beginning Again, made me think of his words, that he quoted in a book, Architecture Oriented Otherwise, of an architect that we both like and cherish, which is Aris Konstantinidis. Quoting Konstantinidis, David wrote, "A true work of architecture will become more effective the less finished it is." And to this, David added, "Unfinished forms invite creative responses, new beginnings." I suspect that what he's going to talk about today bears something to do with unfinishedness, but I can't wait to hear it. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Lewis. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I will indeed try to say something about beginnings. Of the many forms of research in architecture today, the kinds of inquiry that resemble work in either the humanities or the sciences have fairly well-established methods and even criteria of assessment. These kinds of study also take advantage of well-established venues of dissemination and discussion. Here's our problem. The same cannot be said for research through design, even if today many, especially in this country, believe that knowledge in our field is, in fact, advanced primarily through design, no less than through work in the library for the humanities or the lab in the sciences. My hope tonight is to see how architecture can be placed among those fields, or the sense and significance of design creativity as a mode of inquiry. Among architects and educators today, the proposal for design research is generally understood as follows. The design of buildings is not only a professional practice, but also a form of inquiry, a member of the growing family of research disciplines at work in the world today. The older siblings are well known, the highly regarded research fields in the natural sciences, physics, chemistry, biology, and so on. In the next generation are the social sciences, economics, political science, and sociology. Also related are the fields in which the basic sciences are applied. Here I have in mind medicine, engineering, and today, information technology. This last group, it seems, is more akin to architecture, for these academic disciplines are also professions. The problem with architecture is that it also has family ties beyond the sciences, to painting, sculpture, urban design, landscape architecture, even, in my view at least, to literature and poetry. Furthermore, artistic practices are not only non-scientific, many say they are purposeless. We tend to see beauty as its own reward and call it aesthetic pleasure. But these categories, I mean natural science, social science, even the arts, together with the terms that designate them, are no less subject to debate than the words design and research with which I began. Today's wide enthusiasm for research in all fields is rooted in a very long tradition. For at least 2 centuries, centers of learning have turned from received wisdom to research. Professors still profess, but today, a university's greatness is measured by the volume and quality of what we tend to call its research output. Decisions about an architecture professor's appointment or perhaps advancement are made on exactly the same basis, at least largely so. So while the transmission of knowledge, what we generally call teaching, is obviously necessary in higher education, today we tend to think that it's insufficient for society's greatest need, the progress and production of knowledge. So how do matters stand outside the university? While some may think it odd to suggest that research could be undertaken in an architectural studio or workshop, dedicated, as it often is, to business success and career advancement, scientific advances in our time often do occur outside university settings. In recent decades, we've witnessed a steady increase of research centers, institutes, and foundations. Some have close ties with universities, others operate independently, not only to increase knowledge, but in many cases, financial profit. Even work in the basic sciences is no longer centered in academic institutions, still less, and I think unfortunately, in teaching programs, because the institutional support for research today is generally non-academic. The massive and thoroughgoing transformation of society through industrialization has had its effect on universities as much as on any institution of modern life. Anyone involved in research today knows the question concerning funding often determines the scope, setting, and personnel of study programs. In short, research has become an extension of the research industry. Corporations not only supply funding, today they propose topics. Research into building construction, for example, may be supported by the timber industry. Into techniques and aims of visualization, in my university, is supported by the software companies. But the alliance between the academy and business is not without its critics. For the fundamental purpose of science, the advancement of understanding, together with its characteristic style of thought, free inquiry, independent of application, and also critique, especially self-critique, is often compromised by the push toward practical results. So what bearing does all of this have on the discipline of architecture, its teaching and professional practice? As I've said, in my view, design research is not entirely new to architecture, neither to practice nor to education. But rather than present an account of its history, I'd like to introduce what I see to be the interconnections between research, teaching, and practice by examining a case from the relatively recent past. It's what is shown in the illustration here, Louis Kahn teaching at the university. And I see it, and will try to describe it as an equivalent to what Le Corbusier described as patient research. Through this case, I'll try to show how knowledge and skills, even those of the most talented and widely respected architect, are not only transmitted and acquired in the studio, but discovered there, much like laboratory research in engineering and creative work in an artist's studio. Research and discovery are even more important when studio work, perhaps this is the case in schools here, it is in my school, when studio work has become rather habitual. Kahn's text shows that he was very sensitive to the limitations on free inquiry when certain kinds of application provide design research with its goals and orientation. He said, "Only when the university is cleaned of the marketplace can it become a site of real research." As I've studied his career at Penn, it's become plain he actually didn't worry much about external funding. For his studio, even though his friend and fellow teacher for a couple years, Alda van Eyck, was generously supported by the Rockefeller Foundation for his work on the life of the child and the artist in the city. For his part, Kahn remained hesitant. 40 years ago, he observed, university researchers had brought their research goals into close alignment with the interest and funding opportunities of both government and industry. Research on human association in civic institutions was not only funded by, Kahn said it was constrained by government agencies intent on urban renewal in the 1960s. Opposed to such constraints, he said study programs of that kind belong to the marketplace, not to the university. Here's the quotation. "Only the purest kind of thinking, only the kind that leads the individual mind to its specific way of thinking, should be in the university." It seems to me a potentially negative consequence of an exclusively disciplinary focus is the displacement of topics such as construction to industrial partners, whose concern may be less with architecture than optimization and profit. Thought, as pure as Kahn intended, begins with wonder. The courageous and frank admission of unknowing, of doubt about basic things, things such as a room, wall, or window. The first impediment to architectural research that must be cleared is the notion that study programs are dedicated to solving problems, such as the one I just mentioned, the disorder of American cities in the post-war years. Kahn maintained that even if clients pay for answers, architectural research depends on questions, as does creative design. A good question, he said, is much more valuable than even the most brilliant answer. Why? Questions bridge between what he called architecture's measurable and unmeasurable dimensions. One way to think about this is to couple it, this distinction is to couple it with another that was very productive when he first posed it, the difference between buildings and architecture. Architecture, Kahn said, does not exist. Only buildings exist. For this reason, architecture must be searched for as if it had been lost, sought after as if it were out of reach, not once, repeatedly. What the philosopher Edmund Husserl said of himself, that he was a perpetual beginner, can be said, I think, of the architect who has a research program, always beginning again. This self-identification also defines what is the central, and I think really the simple meaning of design research. Its real challenge is that it is a quest without a specific object. I think it explains Kahn's familiar question, how am I doing, Le Corbusier? Kahn, too, was moving towards an architecture in full recognition that one no longer existed. At the same time, he felt, and I believe, one can only imagine architecture through specific buildings. Defining research in this way couples it with the issues of beginnings, what Kahn called volume 0 or -1. Each problem in the design studio is an opportunity for students and teachers to begin again, to reverse the roles of the clear and the obscure, not to make the second the preamble to the first, but to discover what is unclear in what seems so obvious. This means moving forward depends on going backward. And the target of the inquiry is what I think could be called, with Kahn in mind, the beginning of the beginning. While radically preliminary, I think this kind of start also anticipates its end. Maybe we've overemphasized the progressive or additive aspect of research findings. Maybe the time of inquiry isn't linear. Maybe it circles around its topics. Kahn called the beginning an eternal confirmation. It reveals what is natural to us. Obviously, what is natural is always already here. But still, the target of inquiry is unknown. In a wonderful quotation, he said, I try to look at my work with a sense of what is forthcoming, the yet not said, the yet not made. For that is what puts the spark of life into me. But again, the subject matter of his work was the set of tasks he was given in those days in that city. I think this means there can be no approach toward an architecture apart from explorations of the concrete problems of a particular building, its location, program, kind of construction, and so on. So to conclude these opening comments, I'll resolve it in what I take to be a more or less unavoidable paradox. The search for beginnings always unfolds in the midst of current conditions. Kahn is often said to be abstract. I think the reverse is true. Here's my general point. Research finds its foothold in the middle of things, but in that context, it seeks beginnings that anticipate ends. His sense of unending beginnings in research allowed him to offer a surprising view of teaching. As you know, he said, I'm a teacher, which really means I'm teaching myself, and whatever rubs off, the student gets. Again, we find an injunction against routine instruction. I think this means the university is not a place for the transmission of knowledge. Kahn said that's the business of trade schools. I want to repeat what I just quoted. He said, the work of teaching is to present the yet not said, yet not made, a form of self-inspiring. Obviously, this couldn't be done on one's own. The self-inspiring he proposed required dialogue. Therefore, he organized the studio, more or less, in the manner of a seminar. Together with the students were fellow teachers. For most of the juries, here's a representative scene. There were, besides himself, he's white hair in the middle of the front row, Beside himself, the head of the school, in this case Dean Holmes Perkins, leaning forward in a light-colored jacket. Also, another architect with whom he worked throughout his teaching career, Norman Rice. He's sitting in a blue jacket to Kahn's left. But more importantly, I think, Robert Le Ricolet, an engineer, and Robert Ingman, a sculptor. That a group discussed student projects is not surprising. Today, that's the norm. But Kahn brought together what today we would find to be atypical types: architects, engineers, and artists in one jury. Ingman the sculptor and Le Ricolet the engineer were not there to talk like architects. That's a key point. They were included because they were dedicated to aspects of projects that Kahn felt were essential, even if not obviously architectural. Consider first the artist. This is work by Robert Ingman. Kahn believed painters and sculptors are uniquely and intensely expressive. Their works result from inspiration, not calculation. They bring before us images that are compelling and beautiful, even if they show us things that haven't and can't be seen in the natural world. Kahn called them, it's a beautiful phrase, expressive impossibilities. To explain himself, he often referred to two painters, frequently to Giotto, but also commonly to Marc Chagall. When he invoked Giotto, he alluded to the disproportion between a man and his house in some of the paintings. For Chagall, it was a matter of men and women appearing to fly across the space of a room, or in this case, of a landscape. He said, "Now you can see that both Chagall and Giotto knew that man can't fly. They knew a castle is much greater in size than a man. But they were expressing something. Their distortions and impossibilities made a kind of sense. But wonderful as it is, this way of working is not right for the architect." Kahn continued, "The painter has found this marvelous thing in the validity of what he's doing because he's a painter, not an architect, who's something of a different animal. While a sculptor can express the futility of war by placing a cannon on a cart with square wheels, an architect has to use round wheels. The distinction can be summarized as follows. The artist intends possible realities, the architect, real possibilities. But the differences aren't absolute. There's something of the artist in each of us. We all feel the desire to express ourselves, no matter what our vocation. One way we do this is by making things. Kahn called the art of craftsmanship poetry of expression. Craft, like art, brings things into being. It creates life, but through images. Students learning the craft of architecture share with sculptors and painters not only the desire to express themselves, but often the same means, drawings and models. It's for this reason that painters and sculptors play productive roles in architectural education. Without art, architectural education loses something essential. He said, "Our schools fail because there isn't an element about them that brings out in the young architect the sense of himself or herself being an artist. Without art, our schools won't instill the will to work, to discover, to produce something coming from inside yourself." The engineer's role is different. Not a view within, but without. Not into the person, but into the world. Change focus means change results. The outcome of scientific study is not something unseen, but something seen more fully. The engineer, like the scientist, is concerned with measures, with the nature of nature. Unlike the painter, who makes what does not exist, the engineer inquires into what is given, particularly given in the natural world. The engineering, or more properly, scientific concern, is not with new worlds, but seeing the world anew. Kahn wrote, "It's the discovery of nature's powers, that's all. That's what anyone who's a real engineer does." Speaking particularly of his teaching colleague, Le Ricolet, whose work you see here, he said, his desire was to get from nature its most guarded secrets, for those secrets would allow him to put before those who had not yet found ways of expressing themselves, ways they might do so. And finally, he summarized the engineer's contribution as follows: knowledge feeds the desire to express. So when a student presented a project in one of Kahn's studio juries, 3 sets of eyes, 3 viewpoints were there to guide the search for beginnings: those of an artist, an engineer, and an architect. The artist encouraged self-expression, the engineer advocated for what is right by nature, and the architect looked for ways these 2 vantages could be combined. Outside the studio at Penn, these same students took courses in both art and engineering, working in Engman's sculpture studio or in Le Ricolet's structures lab. His longtime collaborator, Auguste Commandant, taught structures every Friday morning. Here's my simple conclusion: good architecture needs more than good architects. So what types of projects were studied and discussed in these ways? What were the vehicles of research in Kahn's studios? In point of fact, he often assigned students one of the projects he was working on in his professional office, usually an institution, let's say something like the British Arts Centre, sometimes, by contrast, a single house. But rarely was a detailed program given. Instead, he introduced projects with a short, more or less philosophical statement, sometimes even a single word. This project is going to be about a room or the forum. His colleague, Norman Rice, then when Kahn left, came back into the studio and gave data on program requirements and location. Rice, for his part, saw similarities between Kahn's way of working and that of his mentor, Le Corbusier. Rice said, "My preceptor, Le Corbusier, who was both a painter and an architect, once told me he fought his architectural battles in his paintings." Then Rice continued, "I believe the discussions in Kahn's studio, with their give and take, helped Lou fight out and resolve many of his architectural battles." Thus, I think another analog for searching study is play. The give and take of dialogue is comparable to playing with and being played by another person. Most scholars know this. Careful reading causes interest in questions that open the book's covers to be affirmed or denied and then recast. The aim of interrogative play is not so much to score points, but build agreement on topics of shared interest with another person, another text, even another time and culture. The basic premise, one that I hold, would like to persuade you to, is that different viewpoints are mutually enabling. In Kahn's studio, those vantages were given by engineers and painters, together with other architects. Surprisingly, perhaps, a similar style of work and communication existed in Kahn's professional office. Kahn wrote that the assistants in his office spent most of their time drawing repeated studies, and distinguished studies of this kind from what he called proper architectural drawings. And I guess by that he meant production drawings, details, and specification. Here's what he wrote: "Kahn's office, in a true sense, was not an architect's office, but a studio. Almost all of his architects, mostly graduates from his class at Penn, tried to behave, think, and act like Kahn. And he was critical of their structural understanding, as he was of Kahn's himself. He wrote, Kahn misunderstood the semicircular roof structure of the Kimball. He reports that Kahn wrongly considered the semicircle an arch, not a beam, which it actually is. But once its workings were finally explained and understood, Kahn changed the design. I mean this to say that in both the professional office and the academic studio, questioning was key, or, if you will, beginning again. Kahn wrote, "Now I wish to tell you what I feel when I enter the classroom. To me, the class is a kind of a check. I really couldn't practice without it. I consider the students sort of pure in their way, and my job is to answer to that purity." So let's turn to one of the themes or topics he used to orient the research dialogue. One type of project Kahn often gave is the monastery. It's also an instance of an institution he researched while he was working on the very same theme in his professional office, and I think can be taken as an instance of searching for beginnings by starting with specific conditions, renewing beginnings in the middle of things. He described his approach as follows. The problem was a monastery. We began by assuming no monastery ever existed. We had to forget the word monk, the word refectory, the word chapel, even cell. My hunch is this was no simple task, but I believe it was an essential methodological premise. Although the search for beginnings was mutual, teacher and students together, Kahn was both more skilled in design and in questioning, for he remained preoccupied with a very few themes throughout his entire life. In the case of the monastery project, given in 1965, he reported no progress had been made after 2 full weeks had passed. I don't think that meant days were wasted. Instead of moving forward, the students and teachers went deeper into primary issues. Then, one afternoon, a key insight was offered by a student. He writes, "A girl from India said, 'I believe the cell is the most important element of this community. The cell gives the right for the chapel to exist, the chapel gives the right for the refectory to exist, and the refectory gets its right from the cell, and that of the retreat is also given by the cell, the workshops, and all that were made possible by the cell.'" Kahn thought fine. Turns out a good premise doesn't lead to a good design. The student's project was poor. While the archive at Penn, you see here, has some of the projects from this period, the one by the Indian girl, on whom the work depended, was never photographed. Others that were show elements and configurations that resemble the forms and patterns Kahn himself was exploring at the time. Biaxial symmetries, centralized spaces opening diagonally, cluster configurations, enfilade planning, repetitions of single forms, particularly, as you see here, the square, and so on. He singled out one project for particular praise, a design by an English student. He found in it a new set of elements, particularly an unusually dominant fireplace and a refectory a full half-mile from the monastery's center. He concluded his account, his little history of this design exercise, saying, "The originality of thought, evident in all the projects, would not have occurred had the students been given a specifically detailed program of requirements." In my view, it's not surprising the plan configurations vary. Some are linear, centralized, others diagonal. Some with single, you see here another, and some with double courts. They also differ in the way their patterns relate to the building's location. Some projects are exceptionally compact, suggesting an introverted institution, detached from the wider milieu. Others open into the landscape, as if outward reach were more important than internal coherence, what he called association, more significant than self-definition. There's also the matter of proportioning. In some projects, all the elements are commensurate with one another. Same-size elements turn 45 degrees to one another, squares set within circumferences of circles, and smaller units, half the size of the larger ones, they join. But other projects seem indifferent to proportioning. They instead express the nuances of different uses. Nevertheless, the basic requirements were the same for all the projects: secluded contemplation, learning, ritual community, and interaction between nuns and visitors from outside. Accordingly, a number of what I think we might call disciplinary themes seem to have oriented all the discussions and the research in Kahn's studio. One was the reality of a well-defined place, as opposed to the then current preoccupation with unlimited space and its ever more immaterial modulation. The room was researched as architecture's degree zero. Another topic of study was the principle of association, cell to cell, as we've seen, but also among the several parts or types within the institution, library to refectory, and so on. This research would clarify the possibilities for what he called an architecture of connections, as opposed to a system of circulation. Connections were sought not only between the parts of the institution, but also the terrain beyond it. Alda van Eyck, his teaching partner for a number of years, called this type of connection reciprocity. He once wrote a very amusing paper, said the medicine of reciprocity needs to be administered to the sick body of modern architecture. While Kahn was exploring the monastery at the university, he was also at work on one of his most fascinating projects, even if it was never built, the plan of which you see here, Dominican Mother House, for a rural site outside Philadelphia. He worked on the project 4 years, 65 to 69. In Penn's archive, there are 16 portfolios of work devoted to the project. And in those folios, 900 sketches, drawings, and prints. The images range from charcoal sketches to carefully constructed plans, sections, facades, and details. Interestingly enough, no perspectives, not a single axonometric. Hundreds of sheets also contain annotations, obviously in Kahn's hand, but interestingly, also those of his assistants. I believe this attests to dialogue in design development. The architect's thinking obtains great tangibility on these sheets. His single-minded dedication to specific research themes, exactly those that he had taken up in his Penn studio work, but also his struggles with the concrete particulars of this specific task, the interest of the nuns, the site, the budget, and local building traditions. The start of the project was disarmingly simple. He drew a number of elements on a sheet of yellow paper that outlined the sizes of key elements within the program, rows of cells for the different types of nuns, older and junior professed sisters, novices, postulants, and so on, but also blocks for the refectory, chapel, and library. From this point onward, Kahn struggled with the arrangement of these same elements, their distances, associations, and connections. His basic question concerned the right relationships between the parts and the whole, as well as the entire ensemble within its wider landscape. Between June and December of 1966, He developed and then presented 3 very distinct schemes. Configurations changed, as did sizes. The first scheme measured about 16,000 meters. The third was reduced to 12,000. Further reductions and simplifications followed in the coming months and years. One of the most remarkable layouts is the so-called collage plan of October 1966. Historians have struggled to make associations between this drawing and the designs of other architects and artists. One of the most convincing, I think, is the association with Isamu Noguchi, with whom Kahn was collaborating at the time on the Levy Memorial Playground in New York City. But that kind of interpretation shouldn't distract us from the discovery this design represents. After spending so much time and energy researching the problem of movement from room to room, the collage drawing shows him hitting on the idea of making connections at the corners of well-defined settings, preserving the clear individuality of each volume, but then also integrating them into one unified ensemble. A good precedent for this is his own work at Erdman Hall. The rotations are apparent in the Fisher House, which are also obvious when you enter the building, but also, as I've said, the Levy Memorial Park. In each case, the space of the whole is articulated through the spacing of well-defined parts. An equally beautiful development, I think, shows his sense of inhabiting thickened walls. At one point in the project's development, he asserted that even the wall can be a room. A beautiful version of this, I'm sure you know it, is at the Exeter Library. My sense of it is delamination isn't required, more like a sense of excavation or digging into the wall's thickness, hollowing, and then extending its elements into the equipment of reading, storage, ventilation, and viewing. But money problems called for still more reductions and still more designs, more and more compact. Yet Kahn still sought to preserve the idea of an ensemble of discrete rooms. The key task of the later schemes was to engage the wider milieu, following the principle of reciprocity. Construction documents were produced for a final scheme, but once the sisters saw the cost, even with all the reductions and downsizing it represented, they stopped work on the project. In the end, as I've said, nothing was built, and today, I guess it would be called upscale housing enclave built by some developer stands on the site. In a very good book on this project, Michael Merrill has called Kahn's way of working, quote, a culture of making. I think it can be seen also as something like a journey. Not one that rides on rails, still less in the air, but one that's grounded and subject to all the congested traffic, roadblocks, dead ends that actual terrain presents, but sometimes straight streets, clearings, and smooth connections. The drawings and discussions in both the university studio and professional office, they show a combination of false starts, reversals, insights, accumulations, and conclusions, all unfolding over time. What was initially sought after sometimes revealed itself to be chimerical. Other times, what appeared at a drawing's margins was thought to be an accidental mark, indicated an unforeseen possibility. I don't think one should say projects of this kind, maybe of any kind, develop by chance, but their outcomes are far from pre-given. Retrospectively, the results make sense, but during the work's unfolding, the process is never entirely clear where it's going. Maybe it could be described as a kind of blind logic that creates itself along the way. The path is often indirect, detouring after advancing, then turning back, renewing beginnings, and moving forward again. Maybe it's something like a mixture of chance and reason. Chances must be taken because repetitions never advance, yet reason must intervene because the initial problem still lacks a solution. Here's another comparison. The games people play would lack structure and never develop momentum if players did not know with reasonable certainty the outcome of certain moves. At the same time, they would fail to excite if foresight could be extended indefinitely. I mean, projects play with and are played by their circumstances. In his last text, Le Corbusier said one thing in the life of an architect is key: to play the game. Such a process is less a matter of foresight and calculation than of cunning, requiring alertness to possibilities as they emerge. Drawings, I think, are the instruments of this emergence, drawings of a particular kind. There is much repetition in Kahn's graphic work. We've seen the same thing in that of his students. On the matter of repetition, the philosopher Søren Kierkegaard once wrote, "The dialectic of repetition is easy. That which is repeated has been, otherwise it couldn't be repeated. But the very fact that it has been makes the repetition into something new." I realize one must be wary when a philosopher says the issue he's about to address is easy. But Kierkegaard's sense of the repetition dialectic accords very well with what appears on the pages of Kahn's sketches. Dedication to just a few themes, repeatedly beginning again, each attempt revealing a new possibility, and sometimes a new insight. As with architecture generally, the same is sought, but never achieved. The pace of the project is, of course, slow. Le Corbusier called his work patient research. In Kahn, it could be described as dogged dedication that never hurries. I think slowness delays progress so that opportunities are not foreclosed. Doors are kept open for the entry of something unexpected that may be better than what seems so obvious. Kahn wrote, it's a beautiful quotation, "While drawing, I'm waiting for something to happen, and I don't want it to happen too quickly." His hand lingered on essential topics. Sketching is a way of abiding with primary questions. The work isn't indefinite. Drawings fix intentions, but leave open the possibility of final resolution. Here again, though, openness was not the end, only the means, for architects must draw the line somewhere. But as I've said, when design is construed as research, lines that have been drawn finally eventually provoke the same questions once again. As I conclude, I'll summarize my argument in basically 5 points. 1, design research in architecture contributes to the discipline when it redefines itself through encounters with neighboring fields, particularly art and engineering. 2, this sort of practice is at once dialogical and individual. In other words, always participatory, but essentially personal. 3rd, it's rooted in particularities of place, program, and production, but at the very same time transcends itself into other projects, recalling some and anticipating others. My 4th point about design research, I said it follows something like a blind logic. Intuitive, but also interrogative. Clear retrospectively, but as it unfolds, never quite clear enough. And lastly, that its history and development are peculiar and quite possibly paradoxical, moving forward by going backward, ending in ways that invite subsequent beginnings. Lastly, I want to comment on the striking contrast between the apparent finality of Kahn's buildings, the inevitability they express, and the doubt, uncertainty, and openness that paced their development, starting from the Trenton Bathhouse, progressing through the British Art Center. I think one would have to mention Dhaka, but also, and perhaps obviously, Salk. Kahn's built work repeatedly reasserted architecture's constancy, its implacable and resolute permanence. Yet continual change seems to have given him these results, continual questioning and rethinking. But rethinking, like beginning again, means his themes were resumed. The study continued, project to project, one set of insights to another, also mistakes. Some decisions surpassed, others retained, each step recasting those before, suggesting others to follow. Altogether, clearing a path that makes great sense when seen retrospectively, even though it didn't at the time. Kahn was a Philadelphia architect, but he became more than that. He was also a man of his time, but I think today speaks to us no less than he spoke to ancient Rome. The outcome of it, it's fair to say, he redirected the modern tradition. I don't believe he ever had that as his aim. His concerns were much more local. I'd like to say disciplinary. The architecture of being in a situation, of association, and of concrete embodiment. Thanks to the depth of his research, these themes are not only his, I think they're ours. And the same might be said for the path, poetry, and most importantly, the prose of his thought. Thank you very much.
So I think we have time for questions. And I think we're going to have also 2 microphones on either side of the room for those who want to ask a question. Are there anyone? Okay. Well, I do have a question. It's basically not even a question, it's almost like to hear you say it again. Because I think it is written here in the blurb of your talk. Let me see if I find it. I don't find it now. I will try to show how knowledge and skills are not transmitted and acquired in the design studio, but discovered and developed there. I think that what was clear to me in this lecture is that research on design happens in the studio, but it also happens in the office or in the practice of the architect. And we somehow are in the belief that research in academia happens also elsewhere, which is, in the programs that are dedicated exclusively to research, like PhD program that you direct at Penn. Can you talk about, or expand, or repeat what you have said about it? Because I think it's a crucial theme that it needs to be understood in the context of architecture and research in the university.
It's somehow a combination of response and vision. He was responding to what was occurring in cities, particularly our city, my city, Philadelphia, but also in architecture. And I said it a couple times, I didn't mean to be repetitive, but tried to be clear that he felt that the accent on movement and on flow, which was the big term then, as it is now, was overdone. That we do pass from place to place, but without departure and arrival, definition of rooms, the movement is insignificant. So an architecture of rooms was the first premise in response to excesses of contemporary practice, the transport engineers in the city and the flow specialist in plan making. That's response. Design research is a response to problems, difficulties, challenges we face in architecture today. But it's not only reactionary. For Kahn, it was a vision of what he called human association, that maybe architecture is a way of binding people together, of making out of the fragments of our lives some kind of coherence. So the principle of association with respect to the architecture of the room gave him a research orientation. So that seems to me kind of setting the stage. But he needs working materials. He's not a philosopher. He's got to have a site. He's got to have a brief. But the first step is to generalize, to abstract, so that he re-enters the domain of his questioning and then begins to rebuild the concreteness in dialogue with, as I said, construction, site, program, and so on. So if we tried to make summary statements about this body of work over 30 or 40 years, we find a person alert to what is at issue in his or her time, being dissatisfied with the problems architecture faces, and envisaging possibilities and working toward them through the office practice and the studio by abstracting or generalizing as a first premise. I don't know what a room is. He did, but he tried to forget what he knew so he might discover other possibilities through the working out of the project. I know what I said is overstating myself, but I do believe it's not entirely wrong to say that research is a quest without an object. You're headed for something the like of which you haven't seen. Otherwise, there's no research. And yet, you know that you have a kind of hunch that's prompting the project. That's what I mean by a vision. And that's all that seems to have happened. And one gathers this from the hesitations, the repetitions, and finally the accumulation of insights that the whole sequence of drawings and models and conversations represents. So in this unbuilt project, 900 drawings. That's not clear thinking, but it's persistent research.
John here.
Please, John.
David, thanks very much for your beautiful talk. And I was struck by the romanticism of some of your first statements in the almost technical sense of the philosophical doctrine of romanticism, that to make art is to kind of imagine that art had no prior existence, that to make an artistic object is to imagine that art comes into existence with the object. And it seemed to me that had something in what you were saying, and I was just reminded of a joke that I think Novalis made to Goethe, that Goethe had invented the Greeks. That the Greeks didn't actually exist, that they came into existence with Romanticism. So on that point, I want to press you to your last point about Rome. I mean, how is it that an architect like Kahn, who's so interested in the discipline of architecture, in precedent, in that long tradition, can also forget that at that particular moment? How can one once have access to the history of the discipline and all the weight of prior research, at the same time imagine that none of that existed when you're making the object?
The philosophical response is a combination of distanciation and appropriation. You don't know anything as you face Campidoglio, and you pick out strange colors, and you make a drawing of it to appropriate it into your style of thinking. But of course he's at Campidoglio, he's not nowhere. So it's in a certain sense, that's why I tried twice to introduce the concept of game, because I actually think that's where you put yourself in play with a serious opponent. And he was in play with antiquity, there's no doubt in my mind. But it was an antiquity that he appropriated into his own way of seeing and of describing. It's this funny line, maybe that's what you're alluding to. Poor Winkelmann, looking at Piranesi drawings, goes to Rome and finds it very unimpressive. And in a certain sense, that's actually what's happening. It's like a set of glasses that 30 years of work put on his eyes. And he started to see the world the way he was trying to make it. And to do that, you need to renounce what we all take to be Rome or Greece or God knows. But at the very same time, that's what you're continually oriented to. So you say no to it in order to appropriate it as your own. And I believe that's a mental discipline that he practiced in the studio, to look through the site and invent it for himself. Sites are not given to architects. They are invented in the project, in my view. At least that's where I think he stands. Likewise for programs. He said the first thing I did when the nuns gave me the brief is I recast it. And they were surprised by what he said. They said, you're making us more of a sacred institution than we are. He wanted everything to be a kind of vision of human communities, even to the sense that the communities of nuns found it too strong for their desires. So it's a very interesting paradox that what you care most about, you renounce in order to make sense of anew. And that is what I guess I'm trying to say about the moving forward and moving backward also. It's a very peculiar process, but the outcomes speak for themselves. What else, please?
Any other questions? Here, there's one down here, and up in the middle.
David,
Please.
Thanks for the talk. I was interested in listening to you talk about Kahn as a teacher, and wondered in the context of where we are today as a University of Queensland talk, and not that I'm an academic, but you always sort of wonder about the pressures of students and what happens to them in the future. And you can almost look back at Kahn's teaching career, and I wonder what happened to his students.
Very good question. Very good question with a not particularly encouraging answer. May I speak anecdotally? I moved there in 1984. Kahn had been gone for a number of years, but it's like I was always waiting for him to come around the corner. Commandant's quotation about the office is an indictment. They tried to act like Kahn. I don't know if it's that way with great teachers, but they were suffocated. There's no other way to say it. People have tried to say a Philadelphia school. Your Canberra? Jurgala grew up in this context, and I believe he's one of the very few who followed his own path after this context. There are a few others, and some historians have written about the Philadelphia school. But maybe when the light is so bright, those around are in shadow. I don't know what it is, but I can tell you another nice story you may like. An Irish architect came, I won't give you his name, loved Kahn as a teacher, did the same program in '63, went back to Dublin. Very good teacher. One of his students, a good friend of mine, heard him lecturing pretty regularly. And then Kahn came and gave a talk at UCD, Dublin. In the middle of the talk, this student, of Kahn's student, leaned over and said, "It's amazing how this guy sounds like our teacher." So people absorbed a lot, and they didn't resist enough, it seems to me. And that's what I meant about distanciation and appropriation. Kahn, It was a continual dialogue with Rome, with Le Corbusier, with a number of people, not many. And he had to do battle with them. He actually had fights all the time with configurations that he had learned, and he had to distance himself from what he was trying to make his own. And I don't think the students, they weren't good students. They didn't say no to their professor enough.
Can I add on to that? Because I think there's a key issue, and I think it is in the images that you've used, which were projects of students and of Kahn, but the ones that strike me as more or important in the context are of the studio reviews. And maybe it's in that sense that that's the legacy of Kahn, as I understand, that it may not be those who were there in that specific time, it may not be that engineer and that sculptor, it may not be that student that is presenting. It's something that we now see happening, and in places more than in other places. My memory of architecture school is a great professor sitting on a table, drawing on top of somebody's project, and a lot of people trying to see what he's doing on the tracing paper, which is very different from what Kahn was doing at that time, you know, yes. Looking from a distance, but in first row, which is something also very strange as an education, you know, like the students are behind, they're not, you know, in front. One student is suffering that situation, that has to be there, he's the victim. So.
It's interesting you say this. It's maybe an odd thing for me to admit in public, but I've made a study of these photographs, and in many of them, the student is off to the side. And it's not that the student was unimportant, but the person was less significant than the project. So I think the person prompted the discussion, and then it spread between a sculptor wondering about the forms, an engineer about their realization, and Kahn somewhere in between, you know, to the higher level of abstraction and saying, but where's the door? You know, and this movement from different vantages, that's where I believe the student entered into the spectrum of issues that are required for insight and understanding in our field. And to believe that one of us, Kahn, Fiduci, one of us is capable of all of that, I think it's false. So he set up the conditions that allowed a student to grasp the full spectrum of architectural topics. And I think that's an insight that we shouldn't be too quick to move beyond. So what Norman Rice said is that Corbusier on the canvas is analogous to Kahn in dialogue. And I believe there's some truth in that the dialogical foundation of architectural understanding that ranges from expression to the science of nature is the context of his thinking.
Thank you. I think there was one question up there that I cut, and it was
That's okay.
ahead of me. Please.
I just had a question, and maybe it's building on that last question. And I'm just interested in sort of the pace of knowledge and learning that you're sort of maybe talking about. And I wondered if you see any differences between Kahn's era of maybe education or architectural education and today, and maybe in the US, but just more generally.
The pace of education, not the history of our subject. Which?
The difference in education in the sort of speed of learning and knowledge in Kahn's era as opposed to
Yeah, I think part of the issue is means. In other words, we have a surplus of means today, and the acquisition of ability dominates a lot. In my school, perhaps here, students go from one teacher, which means one software, to another. And all of the projects get about 20-25% developed, and then they go to the next way of working. I call schools today polytechnics because they're full of techniques. Each of us has his own, and the student tries to get his way of working, my way of working. So there's a quick pace to learning today. But I think much of the work that I see as I look in different schools in different parts of the world is premature. It looks like buildings, but it's really not. It doesn't have that full spectrum, which I think I've tried to say that, and I emphasized it as strongly as I could. He resides in issues. He doesn't move through them. He stays there. He doesn't want things to happen. So I think today we're a lot quicker. And the results, perhaps, in many cases, certainly not all, in many cases show that hasty rush to the appearance of a concluded project. That's my sense of it. I don't mean to be unhappy about this, and I don't want to renounce the possibilities we have. Just the reverse. But there is an issue of acquiring multiple techniques and never residing in them, if I can use that phrase. So the sketching has a pace to it, and what I think where we are today is we're in a time where we're trying to restore that sense of advance and retreat, that back and forth questioning of the intention through different means. And that I think will take us time with different means. So yes, I believe it's quickened, but I don't see that as something to necessarily reject or disapprove of, just to be aware that architecture needs to be seasoned in thought. Okay?
Thank you.
Please.
Okay, John, please.
Thank you. I was just going to ask you how you feel that talent figures in this relationship between great architecture and methodology. What's the dimension of talent?
Often gets in the way. Often gets in the way. What you really want, are you a teacher?
Everything.
What you really want is talents. We've got to somehow catch the richness, and architecture, as you know as well as I do, you need the engineer and you need the painter. You need a person who can read. It's okay to have someone who's articulate. In other words, the studio that one really longs for is where there are a series of strengths, so that each can see what her or his limitations are. The first moment of dialogue is recognition of one's insufficiencies. I need to listen to you because you have an insight that I don't possess. And the studios that work have talents, and not one of them, in my judgment, is superior. That's what's so nice about architecture. You can make your way from different directions.
All right. Is that it, Christian? Well, it's a shame. We would have liked to stay on and on talking about it. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
All right. Thanks very much, David.